Travelers of Reddit, what are your airport horror stories? On a flight from Orlando to Houston, there were heavy storms, and the pilot came over the system and said, "Heaviside, I have some bad news." My heart dropped into my stomach. Apparently though, a plane in Houston had been struck by lightning and planes had been grounded for a few hours. His sad news was that we had to stop in Austin to refuel, because we didn't have enough to circle overhead. I thought we were going to die for a second there. My connecting flight was cancelled, so I joined the queue to get rebooked. Joked with the agent who clearly had had a horrible night. She booked me in first class to my final destination on the next flight and said don't tell anyone. I got to the gate and there was a guy absolutely losing it at the gate agents, demanding a spot on that flight. I would have given it to him, but I honestly was afraid of him getting violent and or subjecting the flight attendants to him. Instead, I stayed quiet like she told me and enjoyed a glass of champagne in the air. While my wife and I were changing planes in Brussels, I led the line of 15 students through security so that my wife could take the end of the line. As I counted them coming through, I reached 14 kids and no wife. The 14th kid tells me that my wife, who is their German teacher, wants me to know that customs has detained one of the students because she had the wrong visa. So, my wife had to stay in the holding room with the kid. The airline, who never should have let the kid board in Boston, lets my wife call the gate where I'm waiting with the kids. They are my wife's students. I'm just helping out. Rather than sending the kid back to Boston, my wife agrees to fly over to London with the kid who is Jamaican by birth and can get the visa issue straightened out at the consulate there. Meanwhile, I take the rest of the group to Munich where I'm now going to have to give the thanks for inviting us speech at the gymnasium. While traveling from the airport to the consulate in London, my wife left her purse in the taxi. Thank God for honest taxi drivers, my wife was able to get her purse back and catch up with us. Then, when getting ready to return 2 weeks later, we were informed by the airline that we have only 15 seats for the return flight. 2 people from your party never entered. I went to Eurovision Tel Aviv in 2019. I immediately ran for the hostel, grabbed my backpack, had a taxi ready, and made it to the airport on time. It was all going smoothly until the time came to try to get my boarding ticket. An interrogation started. Why did you come to Israel? My face literally was still painted with an Italian flag on each cheek while sporting Eurovision gear. How long were you here for? What's your name? Pronounce your name? Why is it pronounced like that? Who gave you that name? I'm Mexican American and have a Spanish name that apparently sounded like Hassan to them. That was enough to get sent to the interrogation room and make me miss my Tel Aviv-Istanbul flight as well as Istanbul-Copenhagen and Copenhagen-Los Angeles. It was fun. We went to Rome and hired a car for the trip. On the return journey to the airport, our sat-nav took us behind the airport down a dirt track. Subsequently, the car got stuck. Our flight was at 6 a.m. and by now it was 3 a.m. We wanted to make an enjoyable time for the airport, and pitch black. However, we could see the lights of the airport in the distance. Breakdown refused to drive down the dirty track to help. We tried everything we could to get the car out. Honestly, digging in the dirt, flashing our lights, making as much noise as possible. We had our 3 small kids in the back, so we wanted to get moving. At 6 a.m. we watched the sun start to come up and our flight take off. And as luck would have it, a passerby saw us and towed us out. Turned out we were stuck in a carrot field. Thank God the farmer didn't catch us. Lo and behold, we ended up £1,000 out of pocket and covered in mud for our new flight home. We must have looked absolutely mental on the plane home. Once my son and I missed a connecting flight in Chicago. When I realized we would have to stay overnight in a city in which I didn't know anyone, I started to lay into the airline worker, then stopped myself and said something like, "Sorry, you must get this all the time. What can I do?" So, we took a shuttle to a hotel, stayed overnight, and went back to the airport the next day. When we checked in, the airline worker remembered me and gave me and my son first-class tickets for our flight to England. We were virtually right behind the pilot. It was amazing. We'd never flown first class before. When I was in college and broke, but full of dreams, I decided to fly into Ecuador for 2 weeks and 2 days before a much bigger trip because the flight to Ecuador, with Spirit, was super cheap. On the way there was no problem, and I had a wonderful time. On the way back, my Spirit flight was delayed by 12 hours, notified 1 hour before the flight was supposed to take off. We were all escorted to a hotel they paid for and were told to come back at 6 a.m. in the morning. It was 2 a.m. by the time we got to the hotel. The next morning, I returned to the airport at 6 a.m. for a 9 a.m. flight, only for the flight to be delayed by another 8 hours due to Spirit not filing the correct paperwork. This leads to me arriving at FLL Airport at 10 p.m., at which point I'd have to drive back to Orlando, where I lived at the time, before my big flight the next day at 10 a.m. I got home at like 3 a.m., packed for my big trip and went to sleep. Woke up the next day at 7 a.m. only to be greeted by the notification that my 10 a.m. flight to JFK is now back to its original time at 8:30 a.m. Rushed as fast as I could and didn't make it. Was put on the next available flight at noon. However, remember how I said I was breaking? Well, this big trip actually consisted of 8 separate bookings, 4 of which were back-to-back starting from the MCO JFK leg, because it's cheaper that way. I originally scheduled a 4-hour layover in JFK, but because they put me on the noon flight out, I wasn't going to make it before booking number 2. This led to me basically missing the next 3 flights, which led to me having to cancel the first half of my big trip because I had no money to book replacement flights. I lost almost $2,000, which was a lot to me back then. Luckily, some of the bookings were refundable and allowed me to buy a flight to do the other half of my big trip. Have never flown with budget airlines again since then and have not done separate bookings since either. During COVID, I was returning from 5 months in Taiwan back stateside. Had a layover in Seoul, and the airport was completely dead. Literally it looked like a sci-fi movie because in the giant terminals the lights were only half on and the only thing moving around were robots with information screens on them. I get up near my gate and have 3 hours before the flight boards, so I set my alarm for 2.5 hours and nap/watch YouTube. My alarm went off at the time I had set it. Walked to the information screen to see if my gate had changed, and as I'm looking at the board I don't see my flight, Seattle, on it. I started getting confused, looked at my phone, saying I still had 30 minutes, looked back at the board, and noticed the clock on there was 1 hour ahead of my phone. Always in the past my phone had auto-changed the time, but this time it decided not to. Soon as I noticed that a security guard came up to me and showed me on his tablet an old picture of me from the first time I went through Seoul 4 or 5 years prior and asked if that was me. Defeatedly I said yes, my phone didn't change the time, and he led me to Korea Air's customer service desk who could only get me on the next flight to the US, LAX, to connect to Seattle in 23 hours, and I had to pay $360. So, my 3-hour layover in Seoul Incheon ended up being 26 hours with nothing open, besides a Starbucks, and hardly any people around. Luckily, they had a relaxation lounge sort of thing, so I moved 2 of the couches together and made a nest to hibernate those hours away since South Korea was on lockdown obviously and I couldn't go into town. Flew out of Schiphol Airport last summer and stood in a line that had no joke, took 6 hours to get past security. The line started outside the building and that itself took 2 hours. I witnessed hundreds of people realize they would kiss their flight. I witnessed marital breakdowns, people cutting lines, people almost getting into physical fights. I was warned it was bad, so I showed up 5 hours before my flight and I only made it thanks to a delay. Even after a delay and the plane waiting another hour for more passengers, we took off with only 40% capacity. Netherlands. It was indirectly COVID related. A lot of security was either let go or left due to extraordinarily little travel during COVID. So, when travel recovered faster than Schiphol expected, there was a huge staffing shortage during peak season due to them not being able to train more security personnel in time, and the pay, working hours, benefits etc. not being that good at the time didn't help with recruitment. It was kind of a national scandal and led to the CEO of the airport having to resign. It's mostly solved now, but mid-2022 was unbelievably bad. This isn't the most horrible, just most horrible, which was really just moderately annoying. Instead of waking up in time to be at the Venice airport at 5 a.m., I decided I'd just take the last bus there around 11 p.m. and spend the night in the airport. I knew I probably wouldn't get much if any sleep there, but figured I could buy some soda or coffee and snacks from vending machines, figuring the airport shops would be closed that late, which they were. But you know what? At Venice airport, they turn off the vending machines after the shops close. Why would they do that? At that point, they wouldn't be competing with the airport businesses, because those businesses are also closed at that time. Every single vending machine was offline. There were no open shops to buy anything from. So, I spent a miserable 5 to 6 hours staring off into space, not being able to sleep in the airport like I knew I wouldn't be able to, but too tired due to inaccessible caffeine to be able to concentrate on reading a book. It was a big WTF that they would render vending machines inoperable once the shops close, when maybe, just maybe, that's when people would most often be wanting to use them. This happened last month. First time in Europe, traveling by myself, trying to leave Dublin airport. I put my suitcase on the bottom of the bus where the luggage storage is, and got on the bus, but the driver at the steps told me I had the wrong type of pass, and pointed to a bus stop a few rows down the busy airport bus road. Something like 10 different bus companies I think go through the airport. So, I rush over to check out where I'm supposed to be and ride what bus. As I'm walking to the stop I see the bus for my pass doesn't come for another hour, so I find another bus coming in 15 minutes and buy that one online instead. This alone was so stressful as I speedwalk looking at different timetables with my slower international internet, and took me at least 10 minutes to realize I didn't have my suitcase, of course now in a much bigger panic once I realized I didn't have my suitcase. I had to pull up yet another bus route map and time schedule and was able to calculate where the bus would be in 1 hour. Took an Uber to that bus stop like 12 miles away, 55 minutes by Uber in morning rush hour, and pulled up with like 3 minutes to spare with the bus pulling up. The same bus driver gave me a big smile and said good work for catching me. In the thickest Irish accent, I still had yet to get used to. In tears at that point from exhaustion and stress I called another Uber to get to my hotel. Overall, I spent €125 on transportation that morning compared to my planned €10 from the airport to hotel. I still can't believe I was able to figure out where my suitcase was, and how lucky I am that I did, considering this was a 2-week trip through Europe by myself and my personal item had just the main electronics/books in them. I'm having an anxiety stomachache just remembering it. Missed a connection in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia. It was the last flight of the day, so they stuck us in an extremely questionable motel. We were on a shuttle bus with a few other passengers, and someone goes, "Oh man, I hope we're not stopping here." Which of course we did. The following day, we were awakened at 4 a.m. for like an 11 a.m. flight and crammed like sardines in another bus with all the passengers and luggage. Finally, as we were sitting by our gate, a panic erupted at sudden gunfire as we saw a row of tanks on the runway approaching the terminal. Turns out it was some kind of holiday/celebration, and they were doing a salute and apparently didn't bother to tell anybody before firing at the airport. I had the worst experience in Kuwait. Had a flight back home from Istanbul with a layover in Kuwait. The Istanbul flight got delayed by 4 hours. No big deal because I had a wonderful time at the airport, so much to do. Anyway, after 4 to 5 hours we finally boarded exhausted, reached Kuwait, and the flight gets delayed again due to severe weather. There are so many flights cancelled that the entire Kuwait airport is filled with hundreds of people fighting. It was chaos. Finally, we are ready to board after 3 hours of delay, have our seatbelt on, and all of a sudden they say the flight has been cancelled. I couldn't believe how that was even possible. We had to wait at the airport overnight and had to be alert all the time listening to the announcements because we had no clue when we were boarding. Now by this time we were starving. The compensation meal was just a sandwich and there were hundreds of people in line for that. So, we decided to eat at the airport, but as the currency is so high, everything was so expensive. Also, we couldn't leave the airport as we didn't have a visa for Kuwait. So, after 27 hours of delay, we finally got to board the flight. Got zero compensation even after filing and filling forms, tweeting, everything. But nothing happened. They did upgrade us to business class, but it was not so worth it. After this experience I will never fly with Kuwait Airways no matter how cheap their tickets get. I was flying Grand Junction, Colorado to Portland, Oregon with a change in Salt Lake. As I was about to board, they asked for volunteers to go on the next flight. I said why not, but they ended up not needing the change. Boy do I wish I had waited for the next flight. Turns out there was a ton of fog in SLC, so we circled for a bit before being redirected to a nearby Air Force base. The next flight made it because the fog cleared, but we got totally screwed. Turns out our whole crew timed out and they had to bus a whole new crew over, which took forever. They unloaded all the snacks and corralled us into a tiny area that we couldn't leave because of Air Force clearance things. We all missed our connections and spent the entire day running around the airport trying to get on replacement flights. We all did bond a bit. Every time someone was successful getting on a flight we all cheered. On my first post-COVID trip, I flew with my wife to Lisbon to vacation for a week. We left our home city at 6 p.m. and were supposed to have a 90-minute layover at JFK. The flight out of JFK ended up being 3 hours delayed, so we ended up with a 4.5-hour layover. We finally got on the plane and landed in Lisbon without further incident. We were tired and starving and looking forward to dropping our bags off at the hotel and getting a late lunch. We get off the plane and get to passport control. When we get there, we find out that the airport workers are striking and that there are only 2 agents checking. The serpentine line goes glacially slow. It is obvious that the 2 agents are intentionally working as slowly as possible. It is hot, everyone is cranky from an overnight flight, and hungry. We are standing on line for 2 hours, and we are maybe 2/3 of the way through the line. All of a sudden, both agents stand up, say they are taking their lunch break, and walk away. The line that was barely moving to begin with comes to a complete halt. The line is also growing as more flights are arriving and those passengers add to the queue. Finally, 45 minutes later the agents return from their lunch break, and we resumed moving slow. It ends up taking another 90 minutes before we finally get to the front of the line and get our passports checked. Overall, we were in the queue for 4.5 hours before finally getting through. My boss and his family arrived at the airport for a vacation flight and were there 3 hours earlier. When they arrived at the gate, the checking person said, "Your flight was yesterday," and they missed 2 days of vacations because they were leaving the right day. And one of mine's, my way back from Kathmandu to France, my plane was late, and I missed the connection and had to wait an entire day in Dubai to get the next one. They provided a hotel and food. Also, I got stuck for 2 days in Marrakesh airport, sleeping there as all flights were cancelled because of the COVID, as I was there while the COVID lockdown was just announced. I was flying from Kyrgyzstan to Belarus with layover in Moscow. The first issue was quite ugly bribe extortion from the airport police. They got some unreasonable excuse, but they managed to snatch my luggage and threatened they won't let me pass through the passport check. I managed to bargain it down, but still had to pay something. Then I successfully got all the way to the boarding. At the boarding pass check I was told they won't let me board the plane as I have no Russian transit visa. The reason was all flights between Russia and Belarus operate as domestic, which means it's necessary to leave the transit area at the layover and pass the Russian passport check. They told me I have 5 minutes to decide what to do, if I want to rebook my flight for later for €100 or miss the flight without any refund. I had no idea how to get the visa and told them to rebook it for 1 week later. The airport Wi-Fi was bad, so I had to go all the way back to the city to find out what to do. I learnt it's only possible for resident to get Russian visa in Kyrgyzstan. I had to travel to Kazakhstan to apply for visa there, which was successful. I was super lucky my nationality was on an exception list, and I was allowed to apply out of my home country. At the end I managed to get to Belarus. I have 2 separate instances, transiting in Toronto Pearson's on the way to Montreal, and I had to go through immigration. Holy hell, was that the biggest line I'd ever seen in my life. All the digital robot screen things were glitching, the airport was heavily understaffed, the officers were all irritated to hell. The previous flight Shanghai had about 100 families needing translators, of which there were none. Absolute nightmare. I was in immigration for 5 hours and missed my connection. I thought I could just waltz up to the help desk in the terminal and get another ticket, but surprise, which was another 3 hours wait in a line full of people trying to call their insurance company, airline, you name it. Everyone was missing their flights and the agents working weren't even listening to the justification of a new flight, they were just handing them out like candy. I got to Montreal and in comparison, YUL was a ghost town. Transiting in Paris CDG on the way to Brazil. Jesus Christ, it must have been be as rude as possible day. Every traveler, staff member, elderly woman with a chihuahua was a complete bitchy bill. Security staff were ignoring any question you asked them, even when in French. This wheelchair escort kept shoving me and bumping into me with zero apology, and shouted at me when he was 100% in the wrong place. The woman scanning luggage screamed in my face to not be so stupid and bring a empty water bottle. When I went to pick up my bags, some French pilots said to me, "You British idiots are always trying to get people to do things for you." Needless to say, I hate that airport. Flew from East Coast to Vegas, 7 p.m. flight to get in at 10:30 local, so more than enough time to get some beers and gamble in. After boarding, we found out flight attendants showed up but not the pilots. After 3 hours sitting on the plane, pilots finally showed up, but by this point the flight attendants would be over their max union hours, so we needed a new flight attendant crew. Everyone got off the plane, boarding time kept getting pushed back in half-hour increments. By the time the new flight attendant crew got there, and everyone boarded, takeoff was 2 a.m. local for a 5:30 a.m. arrival. Wasted a whole night on a long weekend vacation. Maybe not a mishap, but I was flying back from Las Vegas with a stopover in Chicago. As we were landing in Chicago, the plane suddenly pulled up and we were hitting MENAD gas. Everyone was like WTF. Once we leveled out, the pilot came on the intercom and said something along the lines of, "Sorry for the sudden pull-up, the traffic controllers made a mistake and we were about to land, but there was a plane in the way so we had to pull up to avoid it, so basically we were about to crash into the side of a plane." One beautiful night in Vienna, my friend and I were supposed to stay in to catch our morning flight to Split, and we did. We then decided to have one beer at the hostel bar downstairs for a nightcap. We quickly got sucked into a drinking game with people from around the world and got blackout drunk. We made it to the airport 10 minutes after they stopped checking people in. There was only one other flight to Split that day, which set us back €500 each. Was originally supposed to fly to Ohio to see my boyfriend for Wednesday through Friday, and then we were supposed to fly back to my place in Montana. I was supposed to leave Bozeman at 2 p.m., arrive in Denver at 4, leave Denver at 5:30ish, arrive in Ohio at 10 p.m. We were then supposed to leave Friday afternoon at 6 p.m., arrive in St. Paul at 8, and Bozeman at 11 p.m. and then drive 3 hours home. I drove 3 hours to Bozeman Airport, but the connecting flight to Denver was delayed. I was next in line to scan my boarding pass when they deplaned everyone. Told us there was a ground stop in Denver, so yes, we would have to wait 2 extra hours at the Bozeman Airport, but all flights out of Denver were also stopped. Got to Denver, found out my flight to Ohio was literally the only flight to leave on time, and it left while I was in the air. Spent 2 hours waiting in line at the help desk to rebook, but everything was delayed and couldn't rebook on the app. Found a flight from Denver to O'Hare that was delayed 4 hours and would take off at midnight. Got rebooked on that flight and hung out at Denver Airport, had arrived at 6 p.m. Got to O'Hare at 3 a.m., my next flight to Ohio didn't leave until 6 a.m. Slept 45 minutes on an uncomfortable chair, then finally got to Ohio at 9 a.m. on Thursday. Leaving on Friday, we sat on the tarmac for an hour because there was a thunderstorm passing right over the airport. We made it to St. Paul just as our flight was boarding because it was also delayed an hour. We got to Bozeman past midnight and did not get home until almost 3 a.m. I was flying back from South Africa when I was 18 and going through customs/passport control at JFK before boarding my next flight to San Francisco Airport, home. After scanning my passport, the agent called over someone else, who then took my passport and took me to a detention area, where I was held for several hours. Nobody told me anything. Then they took me to some office on the other side of the airport, where a man asked me what I did for a living. I'm in college, okay, have a wonderful day, hands me my passport and lets me go. Never got an explanation. When I got to SFO, I discovered that they had also searched my luggage, destroying the zippers, so it all spilled out on the carousel. Kind of a dreadful day. I was nervous the next time I traveled internationally, but it never happened again. The flight was cancelled, but we were told only 8 hours afterwards. Later I learned that 8 hours is the time when they have to book you on another flight, so they preferred not to tell us about the cancellation and left us in the tiny plane. I was angry, confused and starving. We barely got enough food coupons, and everything was so expensive at the gate. I was fairly young and didn't know my rights as a customer. So, I left the airport in the evening, looking for a place to stay overnight. The replacement was scheduled for the next early morning, so I crashed at a friend's couch, was too far from my own home. I barely slept that night, felt horrible and left early for my next flight. Others shared a car to our destination and got there overnight. The flight itself was fine, it was only a trip of 1 HR. I tried to get compensation for the trouble, received €200 or so. Last year in Jamaica, my partner and I got held up by WestJet security because they couldn't clear my name. I have a very Muslim name and apparently it's common among people who were flagged on a no-fly list. Due to my name, we weren't able to check in on our return flight online, so we went to the check-in gate. From there we were held for hours. We showed up to the airport 4 hours in advance, because the WestJet staff couldn't get a hold of anyone to let us through. Long story short, we missed our return flight and paid out of pocket to fly with another airline on the way home. WestJet never compensated us for the missed flight despite numerous complaints. Afterwards I got a CTN number and things have so far been smooth, but will never fly WestJet again or visit Montego Bay again due to the whole ordeal. Nothing against Jamaica, but that whole situation was so much stress. I flew last week to London with my friend. She thought she could write her exams and get to the airport in 2 hours without checking if she could really make it. Told her that's not possible and she still insisted that I book the flight. When I checked the connection I realized we couldn't make it, so I had to beg my best friend to drive us to the airport to make it on time, what she thankfully did. We had to fly back on Sunday. Soon we checked out of our run at 11 a.m., our flight was at 3:15 so we had 4h to get to the airport. I told her that I would like to go straight to the airport and really don't want to spend more money on tickets for the underground metro because I lost my week pass the night before leaving. She said, I quote, "You were so stupid and had to lose your week pass and now I should chill for 4h at the airport." I missed once a flight from Canada to Europe. I know how odd it is to miss a flight. She wanted to chill the last few hours at Hyde Park, and I was so stupid and said yes even though my gut said no. Ended up spending more cash on metro tickets and we missed our flight. Had to call my company and take another day off and apologize that I can't make it to work. We had to fly with a later plane to an airport far away from home and sleep at the airport and take a 12-hour journey through the country to get home. Plus, I asked her 2 weeks before our flight to get a credit card, which is essential when traveling, but she didn't get one, so I had to pay for all activities. I spent $1,000 for both of us because most of the time you only could pay with a credit card. Till now she didn't mention paying me back. Feel like an idiot. I spent the night in the airport on an overnight layover. I don't think we had the money for a hotel because we were young dum-dums. Checked my bag at the gate in Dublin. Dublin failed to make sure it got on my plane, so they rectified the mistake by sending it on the next one. Of course, I didn't know that when Vancouver, Canada, my layover airport, freaked out and said my bag hadn't been scanned as received by them. My layover was short as it was, and they were going to hold me back at customs, or whatever it was, until the bag came through. Another guy took my info when he saw me panicking and waved me through. I got onto my flight just in time. My airport was nice enough that they took down my information and hand-delivered my bag to my house once it had arrived from Dublin. A few years ago, the Atlanta airport lost all power due to a fire. It made national news. That was also the day we were leaving for a 3-week trip abroad. The airport was a horror show. When we got there it took a while to figure out what was going on. At first it looked like it was just terribly busy. Then we realized the power was out and no one was managing the lines or communicating with passengers. I heard several airport employees say that if the power was going to stay out, they were going to leave, and many of them did. Some of them stayed and refused to do anything to help. They just sat there, and some kind of people watched. Old people were struggling to use the stairs, and no one was helping them. The airline employees stayed and helped out their passengers who were in line to check in. They kept telling us that the power should be coming back any minute. Long story short, 6 hours after we arrived at the airport a family member came and picked us up and we got rebooked to leave a couple of days later. What a nightmare. And we were lucky that we left with our bags and could just leave 2 days later. Many people who had already checked their bags didn't get them back for days and days. I lived in Texas and was going to California to spend a long weekend with friends and their new babies. 2 days before I flew, I had a call from my mom saying that my cousin, who was in an induced coma in the hospital, was probably not going to wake up and that I might want to go to Florida to see him before he passed. She knew I had this trip planned and encouraged me to come to Florida first, then fly out to see my friends. In the chaos/grief of that time, I forgot to call the airline to change/cancel the first leg of the trip. Went to Florida, got to sit with him and tell him I loved him, flew to California, and spent a couple wonderful days with friends and baby snuggles. Went to the airport and was told my flight was cancelled because I no-showed the first one. The only flight I could get on was the next day. Took a cab to my friend's house, slept 3 hours, and went back to the airport. Had to connect through DFW on my way back to Austin. Of course the 45-minute flight was delayed 4 hours. Call from mom, cousin has passed, could I please call several other family members to share the news? Nothing like getting the call while browsing Hudson News and then calling people and telling them about this terrible news with airport announcements in the background. The worst day pretty much ever. I stayed up partying all night at a club in Berlin and went straight to the airport at about 7 a.m., roughly 3.5 hours before my flight boarded. I was the first one in the terminal and laid across 3 chairs to take a nap. Woke up in an empty terminal, jumped up and ran to the window and saw the plane rolling away for takeoff. No one bothered to try and wake me up, but I kind of understand, because I was the man laying on 3 chairs. I was out partying in London on a flight the next morning. I missed the tube station and threw up on the train. I thought I could do a bag drop and then have a shower before the flight, but ended up having to run for the gate where I was the last person on board a 12-hour flight to Singapore, where I was connecting straight on another 12-hour flight to NZ. I thought I had time to get a shower in Changi, except for the slight delay and the change of gate that meant I was just running across Changi to get to the next gate. But hey, at least on this flight I was just hungover and filthy after being up for 40 hours, not coming down and sobering up. And yes, I apologize to anyone who had to sit within a few rows of me. I used to work on cruise ships. My job, I had to handle pyro for the shows. I was told to not handle it for a couple weeks before flying as pyro dust stays on your hands for a while. Well, the day before I flew home, I handled some pyro. At the airport, the next day I got a random swab check, and it went off. I got pulled aside and questioned. I showed them my pyro card and they pulled me into a waiting room while they investigated. Eventually, after some time I was released, missed my flight. Now every time I fly I get random checks. Also, on a side note, I have worked on 7 ships, one caught on fire and the second lost power for 12 hours. The other ones were all right. I was in Paris and needed to be up early to grab the bus to the airport. Being young and not having a lot of money to afford a cab, I realized the trains didn't run early enough to get me to the bus station in the morning. I packed up as quickly as I could and caught the last train thinking I could sleep at the bus station, to find out that there is no station, just a small shack that opened half an hour before the bus left. I was advised to go sit at a McDonald's on the Champs-Élysées till I could walk to the bus at 5 a.m. Well, McDonald's does not stay open all night like they said, and I was kicked out. I went and stood in front of an exceptionally large sign right next to the road. There were so many drunks and homeless, I felt this was safe, that I couldn't get stabbed or grabbed, and if I felt unsafe I could jump out in the road quickly to draw attention to me. About 90 minutes into standing there terrified out of my mind, this guy walks by and is staring at me, and I was very uncomfortable. I yelled at him, "What do you want and why are you looking at me?" He responded with, "Why are you looking at me?" At that point I broke down crying, explaining my predicament. He said he needed to be somewhere but would come back to help me. Another 45 minutes I stood there and he finally walked back. He worked it out with a friend that I could stay in one of the cafes that they pack up for the night and pay someone to watch to make sure no one sleeps in those spots. I sat there hiding from everyone, scared out of my mind, frantically writing in my journal. At one point I looked over my shoulder and this woman was hovering over me and I screamed. It was the H&M billboard model on the side of the building, and that is how scared I had gotten. In my defense, I also was going on extraordinarily little sleep. When it came time to walk to the bus station, I had no idea where I was going before cell phones. I found a very drunk young man who said he would walk part of the way with me and was trying to teach me French at the same time to help me get to the bus station, which there was no way I was remembering any of that. He pointed me in the direction of where I should walk and we parted ways, and I had no idea where I was going. I saw a young family with a suitcase and thought they had to go to the bus station, so I followed them and got to my destination, tired and terrified. Paris was a horrible experience, and I was a single female backpacking alone for a month across Europe. It was an amazing trip, and my travel journal is full of funny stories that I go back and read. Some of it still gives me anxiety. This was just one story. Ended up hitchhiking in Wales, lost my wallet in Rome, and ended up sort of panhandling for money. Set the fire alarm off in the hotel in Dublin. Adventure is a disaster narrowly averted, and my trip to Europe was an adventure. I will never fly out of Heraklion ever again. It was dirty, the employees were rude, and they didn't put up flight info until 15 minutes before departure. We were crammed in the airport like cattle with no AC. They also changed my partner's seat at the last minute, so we ended up not even sitting next to each other. Just awful and disorganized all around. If you're a new Canadian citizen, you have to fly back to Canada on a Canadian passport, not the passport of the country you've been using your entire life with your proof of citizenship. From the USA. 24 hours sleeping in the airport, an extra $2,000 of flights to get 2 people home from Hawaii that was originally a $500 RT flight. Having to split up and fly home and then drive 6 hours to pick up GF from USA because could only fly domestically. To the CBSA bureaucrat gal in Ottawa that didn't know why the system wouldn't allow boarding and had to be explained why each of your several courses of action were wrong and not applicable because you didn't understand this bit of policy minutiae, could have made the fly/no-fly decision in our favor but chose to deny a Canadian access to their own country. I was headed to Canada, originally booked out of Austin. But then I started dating a guy in Houston, where my connection was on the way. So, I decided to pay him a visit and start my trip on the Houston leg. He also had a flight that morning but 3 hours earlier. I'm going to FF here. We got hammered the night before, got up earlier to take him to the airport, decided I'd go ahead and check in and get my bag dropped, giant snowboard bag. Then they asked for my passport. It was back in Austin. I call my brother and he drop everything, goes to my house, gets in the back door after jumping the 8-foot fence, I direct to my passport in the safe, he starts moving to Houston. Meanwhile I had already started driving back to Austin. We eventually meet, he tosses it and some change for the toll road through the window. I started jamming back to Houston. I decide to valet to save my ass, literally toss the guy the keys as I am sprinting to the ticket counter and say, his name will be back Sunday to pick it up, and some other info. I get back to the counter at exactly 1 hour from takeoff, I gently slam my passport on the counter, everyone there already knew my face and my story from earlier that morning, and I exclaim I won the amazing race, put my hands in the air and praise baby Jesus. They hurried off my bag and sent me on my way. My snowboard bag didn't make it, but I did. The next morning, I got up, went to the thrift store, and got some ski clothes. Went to the mountain and rented a board. Had an amazing day, one of the best maybe ever, on the mountain and came back to my hotel to find my bag had been delivered, hit the hot tub, called it a win. One of my favorite ski trips to date. I felt a successful conclusion story needed to be in the mix. Almost missed my connecting flight at Newark Airport. I was interrogated by a security guard while technically exiting the airport since that's how their customs area works. Then the light rail doors wouldn't open for over 15 minutes. When I finally got to the security gate, the security team was yelling at me that I had too many carry-on items. I had my carry-on suitcase, a backpack, and a freaking fanny pack around my chest. They counted the fanny pack as an extra carry-on item. I had to stuff it in my backpack to get through. While on the security line, they yelled at everyone and made customers stand by their bins. We weren't allowed to push them onto the conveyor belts until one lady said so. So again, stood there waiting and waiting. When I finally got through, my hat was missing. They decided to put it in a separate bin, and it ended up getting all dirty. I have never run to my gate as fast as I did. I was positive I would miss my flight. I didn't, but when people say Newark Airport is the worst one, believe them. Someone else's horror story I met as I was headed to Burning Man. At a turnout in the Sierra, some Israeli kids pulled over to take a break. One comes over to chat me up. We realize we are all headed to the burn, then he randomly asks if I have any acid to share. I say no and ask why he was so direct in that question. Apparently he had left an entire sheet of acid hidden in a magazine in the seatback on board the airplane. Bummer, man. So, I gave him some acid and sent him on his way. When I was in Florence, the morning of my flight to Paris, there was a marathon in the city center and all of the trams to the airport from the city center were cancelled. All of the detours and temporary bus routes were posted in Italian only. There were no taxis available at the taxi stand. Rideshares kept canceling on us. Eventually we walked about a mile and a half with our luggage to catch a tram that went to the airport, and when we arrived, our flight was delayed.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.